Hi, I'm Kelly Chase and this is History Detective, and today I would like to talk about the nuclear testing in the 1950s and 60s in Maralinga, Australia by the British government and the devastating effects that had on the people and the environment. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this video is being recorded today. I pay my respects to the elders and knowledge holders past, present and emerging. Before we get into the testing in Australia, we have to travel back to the end of World War II so we can find out why the British felt the need to set off nuclear explosions in the Australian desert and why the Australian government said, "You can blow up your bombs in our backyard." Britain, the USA and the USSR were in an alliance during World War II, and they were having conferences to work out how they were going to conquer their common enemies of Germany and Japan. At the final one of these conferences, on the 24th of July 1945, the US President Harry S. Truman casually mentioned to the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, that the US had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin took the hint and realized that the US had an atomic weapon and was noted to have later said, "We'll have to speed things up." Some historians argue that this apparently nonchalant exchange marks the very beginning of the nuclear arms race. Less than 2 weeks after Truman and Stalin's exchange at the Potsdam Conference, America dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, immediately killing an estimated 80,000 people. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. As you can imagine, the use of nuclear weapons and a fear of their destructive power created a political climate of anxiety. The race was on for countries to develop their own nuclear weapons. The US was testing bombs in the Marshall Islands, in the Pacific Ocean, and in Nevada. Then in 1949, the Soviet Union set off its first nuclear test and then went on to do hundreds more, both above and below ground. In the 1960s, both France and China joined in the testing race. However, today we will be looking at the British nuclear tests that occurred on Australian soil, the gross misconduct that occurred during these tests, and the shroud of secrecy that surrounded them. In early 1950, the Prime Minister of Australia, Sir Robert Menzies, received a request from the Prime Minister of England, Clement Attlee, requesting if Britain could conduct their nuclear weapons testing in Australia. Without so much as talking to the politicians in his cabinet or requesting any information or reports on the possible health or environmental risks, Menzies said yes, and even committed Australian servicemen to help the British carry out their tests. Thus began the testing in Montebello Islands off the coast of Western Australia and the 2 sites in South Australia, Emu Field and Maralinga. Clearly not a scientist, in a 1953 statement to the press, Menzies said, "No conceivable injury to life, limb or property could emerge from the tests that have been made in Australia." Now to Maralinga. For thousands upon thousands of years, the Uldea well had served as a sustainable water source for the First Nations people of the Nullarbor Plains. The Nullarbor Plains is about the same size as Great Britain. However, when a train was built to cross the Nullarbor in 1917, this thirsty piece of Industrial Revolution technology managed to suck the water source dry in a matter of 20 years. Around this same time, the government began to create missions to accommodate Aboriginal people who had been displaced from their land. In 1951, about 470 First Nations people were removed from their country at Maralinga and taken to a mission at Uldea. Then in 1955, an area of about 3,000 square kilometres was secured as a government atomic testing site. It was known by the government that Aboriginal people may still be living in the area. There was initially only one man appointed as a patrol officer, and then later a second to secure this entire area. To have only 2 people patrolling an area that size and searching for First Nations people who were familiar with the land and who'd been using this area as a throughway for generations was seemingly an arbitrary attempt to ensure the safety of the local First Nations people. There is an account of a family who camped near a nuclear bomb crater for 7 7 months after the detonation and suffered stillbirths, brain tumours and premature deaths. Many other First Nations people suffered sickness from coming into contact with the contaminated fallout in this area. But if a family can camp in a nuclear bomb crater for 7 months without being noticed, then this demonstrates the ineffective level of care that was being taken to ensure human safety. The First Nations people who did survive have since had a very long history of health issues, including cancer, lung and liver issues, and of course, many of them have died young. The First Nations Australians were not the only ones whose lives and health were disregarded in these nuclear experiments. Often the soldiers who were present at the nuclear tests were wearing just a uniform of shorts, a shirt and a hat, and were told, "Turn your back to the blast and put your palms into your eye sockets." Some RAAF airmen were ordered to fly through the mushroom cloud without protective clothing to conduct sampling. This was the experience of many of the 8,000 personnel who worked at Maralinga during the testing. Although the Minister of Supply assured the newspapers of the time that precautions guaranteed the safety of everyone in the village, soldiers reported that they were ordered to go into radioactive areas before being taken back to camp to be hosed down and monitored, just like human lab rats. Many of the descendants of the veterans who were exposed to radiation at Maralinga were born with illnesses, including tumours, Down syndrome, cleft palates, cerebral palsy, missing bones, and heart disease. The clean-up of Maralinga was dubbed Operation Brumby. It was a haphazard and half-hearted clean-up operation. Some of the contaminated debris was buried in trenches and then covered with concrete. Other efforts included ploughing the nuclear contaminated soil back into the ground. There has since been a $108 million rehabilitation program implemented, and the test site was returned to the traditional owners in 2009. The way that these tests eventually came to a stop was through the signing of the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in outer space, the atmosphere, or underwater. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and if you would like to hear an original song on this topic, you'll find a link to Children of the Dutch up there. In the description below, you'll find a link to my website where you'll find a list of references and links to teaching resources. This is Kelly Chase, on the case.